Anin Buju Gakina. Greetings, everybody. So today I want to talk about the early ideologies of colonialism, what I think are better termed the early rationalizations for colonialism, that is, the ideas that were used to justify to other Europeans why it was okay to go in and take lands and lives away from indigenous peoples. It's best to take an international look at this, I believe, because while Columbus came to what we now call the Americas in 1492 and started that era of colonialism, that colonization, European colonization, spread around the globe and has impacted indigenous peoples significantly in the last 500 years. Maybe to kind of get a grasp of that, in the year 1800, fully 50% of the world's land was still in indigenous tribal hands. Fully 50%, 50, half the world's land was in indigenous tribal hands in the year 1800. Since the Industrial Revolution had just started a few decades before that, and Europe was undergoing immense appetite for resources for its industrial processes, it soon ran out of the resources it needed to fuel its industrial machine and started looking elsewhere. And indigenous lands happened to be so well cared for, so well lived on, that they were very abundant and rich in the resources, as Europe saw it, that Europeans needed. So it's really good to take this in a big perspective, because it wasn't just Native America that was impacted by these ideologies of colonialism, and I think it helps to kind of understand the fuller context if we take a look at that big picture. So Columbus came in 1492 to what we now call the Americas, and when he landed here, he didn't realize that he had come to a continent that was entirely new to his contemporaries in Europe. I say to his contemporaries in Europe because there are possibilities that there was European contact with what we now call the Americas, with native people here, over the millennia. Some, Vikings, Gaelic folks from Ireland, and other possible encounters may have occurred. But for Columbus, in his several centuries surrounding him, he was the first of his European contemporaries to come to what we now call the Americas, but he didn't realize that. He thought he was in the Indies, and he, as far as I understand it, he never realized that he had come to this, what for him and his European contemporaries was a new continent. And what was, of course, for the people who lived here, a very old continent, as you can look at with things like the indigenous Paleolithic and such, with habitation here going back thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. So it was not a new world. That was only a European perspective. It was a very old world for the people who called this land home. Columbus came here in an era in European history where Europe, as I may have spoken about in other videos before, other lectures, where Europe was suffering a lot from the effects of overpopulation and all the things that come along with that, the people suffering from diseases, from warfare, from huge social injustices, from tyrannies. The list goes on. And this is what you find in overpopulated societies and the Americas, and then subsequently other indigenous lands as the centuries went on and the colonization expanded. The Americas were like that vent for Europe's overpopulation and Europe's excess numbers, not in the sense that individuals didn't count, because they certainly do, but in the sense that the land was no longer able to provide for them. Those so-called excess numbers spilled over into indigenous lands in the Americas, in Africa, in Australia, and other places around the world. So let's take a look at what ideologies were being used to justify, rationalize European takeover of indigenous lands, which was really an attempt to address European overshoot. Their overshoot of going over the carrying capacity of their land. So this first slide that we're taking a look at is actually painted by an Gamma artist known as John Hunter. He's from Australia, from the Aboriginal communities there. And it depicts Britain's arrival in the late 1700s. I start with that just to kind of contextualize us, for us to recall and remember that what happened here on Turtle Island and in Americas as a whole happened to indigenous peoples around the world at different times after 1492. So Australia was reached in the late 1700s, and that's when it started undergoing colonization by Britain. One of the first doctrines to look at is the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery issued as a declaration, or what's called a papal bull, from the church at the time. And this was back in 1493. If European Christian explorers come into a land and it is devoid of Christian people, then those European explorers have the right to claim that land, right? So it didn't matter that people were living there. If they weren't Christian, they didn't have a right to their land. If they were Christian, then they did. That was how it worked. There was only one Christian church at the time. So a lot of people will blame this on the Catholic Church, which is technically correct, but the Catholic Church was the only Christian church at that time. What I want you to be aware of is that as the Reformation comes about in the 1500s and so on, and the Catholic Church gets broken out into several different denominations of Christianity, the Anglican, the Protestant, and you still, of course, have the Catholic. Those other churches, even though they are not Catholic, but they are Christian churches, they carry on this concept of the ideology of the Doctrine of Discovery. So it wasn't just Catholics who held this Doctrine of Discovery. It was the Protestants, it was the Anglicans, and then it was the governments themselves who were not supposed to be like in the United States, supposed to have the separation of church and state. The governments themselves carried on this Doctrine of Discovery and acted on it as though it was a justifiable legal doctrine. So the church may have started it when it was the only Christian church. The Catholic Church may have started it when it was the only Christian church. But it actually passed other sorts of laws or edicts that canceled it out, such as in, looking at my dates here, in 1537, Pope Paul III issued a decree that opposed the enslavement of indigenous peoples, and in which he writes that the indigenous people should, quote, by no means be deprived of their liberty or the possession of their liberty, even though they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ. So Doctrine of Discovery, issued by a papal bull in 1493 by the Christian Church, which was the Catholic Church at the time, carried on even after the Christian churches split apart into their various non-Catholic denominations, carried on by the colonizing governments, even when they separated from any sort of religious influence, at least legally speaking, and the Catholic Church undercutting the Doctrine of Discovery with an edict issued in 1537 saying indigenous people should not be deprived of their property or liberty. Here, we continue that Doctrine of Discovery has not gone away, and it's really important, especially now. It used to seem like science fiction when we were talking about space travel and how our ideologies of colonization, how we rationalize colonization. When I used to say, let's think about that in terms of space travel, it sounded way out there, but now we're on a possible cusp, if our technology allows us to do this, of actually having to wrestle with these doctrines all over again. What are we going to be using? Are we going to learn anything from the past? Another concept that was used, especially in places like Australia, was a concept known as terra nullius. Terra nullius was based very similarly to the Doctrine of Discovery. In Australia, under the British, who were not Catholic, by the late 1700s, when they came to Australia as non-Catholic Christians, they claimed Australia under the concept of terra nullius, which was essentially, if we don't see any Christian or quote-unquote civilized people living here, we have the right to claim this land. And that concept of terra nullius, the justification of Britain's takeover of Australia, remained in international law until the 1990s, right? The 1990s. Another major concept that was used to justify the takeover of indigenous lands or to rationalize it is the whole concept of the Doctrine of Conquest. The Doctrine of Conquest. This is essentially might makes right. If you can bring in enough military and enough soldiers and kill enough people and kill more people than the other people can, then you have a right to take them over. A lot of people think this is how history works, but it works. This is what European history is filled with. But world history is not necessarily filled with this. If you are talking about the history of civilizations, that is, we'll talk about that word in a minute, city-based societies, then yes, you're talking about a history of this constant conquest. Who's going to be able to outgun who? But if you take a look at the much larger picture of human experience that extends, 200,000-300,000 years, according to anthropologists. That is not the story of human history. Yes, there have been wars, but there have been just as much times of resolving conflicts through other things like games such as lacrosse and other team sports. Of course, diplomatic relations, negotiations, those have all existed and are documented, in tribal societies. So, but the doctrine of conquest was used by Europeans to justify their takeover of indigenous peoples, simply saying if we can kill enough of them and out-militarize them, then we have a right to take their lands. Some of the methods that were employed when Columbus landed down in the Caribbean, they literally used what are called dogs of war, where they trained these dogs to attack people. And there's really some gruesome descriptions that I don't need to go into here, but the pictures show it enough. Dismemberment, disemboweling, that's what these literal dogs of war were used to do to indigenous peoples. And that helped justify and rationalize to the Europeans, many of the Europeans, their right to take over indigenous peoples and their lands. It's important to note as we go through here that there were Europeans who even traveled with some of these early explorers like Columbus and those who came immediately after him, who actually objected to what they were seeing happening, the dogs of war being used on the native peoples, the enslavement of native peoples, the just the massacre, the horrible things that were happening. People like one of the priests who came along when the missionaries, Bartolome de las Casas, he wrote back to the Pope, said, "This is horrible. You have to do something. Because when they came over under that Doctrine of Discovery, part of the assumption was if they weren't Christian, they also were starting to assume that the native people did not have souls. And so when Bartolome de las Casas was writing back to the Pope, he says, you have to something to stop this carnage. It's horrible what's happening to the native peoples here. The Pope actually did issue another declaration saying, you have to treat these native people as people. They do have souls. So it was because of people like de las Casas protested against the treatment of the native people that the Pope issued things like saying you must treat the native people better because they aren't soulless as we had originally declared them to be. They actually have souls. So that's a good thing, right? But it seems strange that why would you have to even announce that? One of the biggest things that helped to rationalize European colonization really wasn't anything to do with the doctrines or, established ideologies that have been written about. It was just simply boiled down to perceptions. Really the underlying causes, I would say, of colonization, besides the social issues, the overpopulation, the pressure that comes from that I talked about, but the underlying cultural cause for these rationalizations is that Europeans simply didn't see native peoples as their equal. They saw them as backwards, as crude, as even worse, in using terms like savage, which if you look it up in the dictionary, it says things like bloodthirsty, cruel, just, some of the really worst things that you can possibly use to define or describe people. And then they have the word tribal people or primitive people. So although that definition of savagery is that these tribal people are associated with being bloodthirsty and cruel. When in reality, of course, people who are so-called savages, the people they were calling savages are people like what you see here on the screen. Now, it's really important also to go back to that dictionary and look at the root word of savage, because that root word of savage doesn't mean bloodthirsty or cruel. It simply means of the woods or wild. Of the woods or wild. So in the European cultural psyche, being of the woods or wild was intimately connected with being bloodthirsty, being cruel. And that's really important to remember. Because when you contrast it with how Europeans perceive themselves, they saw themselves as civilized, as representing civilization. If you look that word up in the dictionary, you find civilization as all these good things like order and culture and achievements, cultural achievements and establishment of governments. And in fact, in some dictionaries, they define it as the human ideal. And then when you look at that dictionary and you find what the root word of that word civilization is, it simply means city. So in the European cultural psyche, everything that has to do with the city is considered good and advancement and ideal. Just to add as another perspective on this cultural psyche, if you look up words that are associated with the country, with rural life, like the word rustic, you find they're better off in this cultural perception than people who are from the woods or wild, but they're still kind of boorish. They're not advanced enough to be considered the equals of people who live in the cities. So it's just this huge range of, right in the English language there, that really reveals a lot about how the European cultural psyche approached Native peoples, particularly those Native peoples who did live in the woods or the wild. Of course, many of the people, particularly in South America, that they ran into lived in cities, but that's when you have the concept of, well, they're not Christian, they're still not good as we are, and they go on to justify their takeover of them as well. So it was a complicated reason, but then again, gets right down to it, not really so complicated. It's just pure racism, and a cultural preference for urban life as opposed to life that is lived more rurally or more in the woods or the wild kind of idea. And that gets right down to how we perceive other people as worthwhile or not. And this particular culture that brought this colonization over judged those people it saw as not worthwhile. It made a judgment that there were people who were worthwhile and who weren't, cultures that were worthwhile and who weren't. And those cultures that were worthwhile were cultures the European cultural psyche saw as like them. But even when they were, it still had to use, like the city-based Native peoples that they ran into here, in particular in the South Americas, even then they used justifications. Well, they're not Christians, so we still can take their lands from them. They just wanted the land. They wanted the riches, and they coupled that. They backed it up with their racism, and went on from there to continue their colonization for the next several centuries. I want to make a note here. I'm saying they and I'm saying them. I'm talking about a culture here, a European culture, which, when we're talking about that, we're talking about the primary tendencies, the general tendencies, what we saw on the surface. But this doesn't mean that everybody who came from that culture felt that way. There were a lot of people who disagreed, who were European and disagreed with the treatment of Native Americans. And we need to keep that in mind. And in fact, during this colonization process, there were a number of people who were colonists themselves, came over to places like Jamestown in Turtle Island here in what we now call North America, and later came to call the United States, who actually left their colonies to go live with the tribes and preferred to be with the tribes. This evidently was such an issue that some of the colonies actually started passing laws making it illegal to leave to go to live with the tribes. So there were different, even though we talk about the European culture and its cultural psyche, I want you to always keep in mind that there were dissidents among them as well. There were people who didn't conform to those same sort of ideologies or perceptions of Native people, that there was variety even among European colonists and Europeans back in their home countries. All right, so that's our beginning look at the fourth fire and the coming of Europeans to what we now call the Americas. All right, I will talk to you later. Bama P. See you later.